It was a damp, chilly autumn afternoon in Seattle's Central Park. A thin veil of mist hung low over the paths, and golden leaves softly drifted down, carpeting the walkways as if trying to erase every lingering trace of summer. Amid the quiet solitude of the park, only two figures disturbed the stillness, trapped in a heavy, painful silence. Sitting quietly in his wheelchair beside a bench was Ethan, a 10-year-old boy whose expression was devoid of any emotion. His once bright and joyful eyes were now empty, reflecting nothing but the profound pain of his loss. The terrible accident had taken away not just Ethan's beloved mother, but also his ability to walk, leaving him imprisoned in a cold, mechanical wheelchair. A few feet away, Jonathan Reeves, Ethan's father, sat absently scrolling through his phone, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. At 67, Jonathan was a billionaire who seemingly had everything a man could desire: a prestigious career, immense wealth, and a luxurious mansion that others could only dream of. Yet none of those possessions mattered as he watched his young son battling overwhelming despair day after day. Countless sleepless nights had passed with Jonathan helplessly witnessing Ethan suffer from recurring nightmares, anxiety, and fears, unable to offer anything beyond awkward reassurances. Suddenly, Ethan's panicked breaths cut through the silence. The familiar wave of anxiety was returning. His small hands trembled violently, and his eyes filled with terror as haunting memories of the accident rushed back. Jonathan stood helpless, desperately searching for words of comfort, but nothing he said seemed to soothe Ethan's anguish. Just then, a homeless woman named Mary, around 50 years old, gently approached them. Ignoring her worn-out appearance and the cautious look from Ethan's father, Mary quietly knelt beside the terrified boy. Using her soft, calming voice, she patiently guided Ethan through slow, even breaths. Then, from her worn coat pocket, she pulled out an old, well-loved teddy bear and placed it gently into Ethan's shaking hands. "Whenever I'm scared," she whispered, "I hug this little guy close to my heart." Ethan took the teddy bear, surprised yet deeply touched. His trembling slowly eased, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a warmth and comfort that neither his father nor the best doctor's money could buy had ever managed to provide. Jonathan sat silently on a park bench, his eyes glued to his phone, lost in a whirl of business emails and urgent texts. The autumn wind blew cold and damp through Seattle's Central Park, scattering leaves around his feet, but he hardly noticed. Just a few feet away, his 10-year-old son Ethan sat motionless in his wheelchair, his vacant eyes fixed on nothing in particular, his expression blank yet haunted by invisible scars. Suddenly, a desperate, strained breathing broke the silence. Ethan's frail body began to tremble violently, his hands gripping the wheelchair's armrests as panic surged through him. The memories of that dreadful accident rushed back vividly: the screeching tires, the shattering glass, the moment he lost everything. Ethan's heart raced uncontrollably, the air struggling to fill his lungs as fear tightened its grip around him. Jonathan immediately snapped back into reality, but stood frozen, helplessly watching his son suffering another terrifying anxiety attack. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the perfect gesture, but nothing came. He had seen countless doctors and therapists struggle to soothe Ethan, and now in this critical moment, he felt painfully powerless. Nearby, unnoticed until this moment, Mary, a homeless woman in her early 50s, quietly observed the scene unfolding. Her clothes were worn, her shoes battered, and yet there was something gentle and comforting about her presence. Without hesitation or fear of rejection, she slowly approached Ethan, softly knelt beside him, and spoke in a voice calm and tender, like a mother comforting her child. "Listen to my voice, sweetheart," Mary whispered softly. "Breathe slowly with me. In and out." Her soothing words gently guided Ethan's ragged breaths back into a calm rhythm, the trembling gradually subsiding. Then, carefully reaching into her worn-out coat, Mary produced an old teddy bear, faded and threadbare from years of comforting embraces. She gently placed it in Ethan's shaky hands, softly saying, "I always carry him with me when I feel afraid. He helps chase the scary thoughts away." Ethan stared at the bear in surprise. Then, instinctively, he hugged it tightly to his chest. Warmth spread through him, chasing away the lingering shadows of his fear. For the first time since the tragic accident, Ethan's shaking ceased entirely, replaced by an unfamiliar peace. From a short distance away, Jonathan watched silently, utterly astonished. This woman, whom he might have ignored in any other circumstance, had effortlessly done what he, despite all his wealth and connections, had failed to do. She had given Ethan comfort, and more than that, she had given him hope. The morning was still wrapped in a misty chill when Mary awoke, curled beneath the thin blankets inside her makeshift shelter near the park. As she stretched, she noticed a sleek black limousine parked quietly by the curb, oddly out of place against the backdrop of cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered walls. Before Mary could fully process the unusual sight, a well-dressed chauffeur stepped out and approached her cautiously, his polished shoes clicking softly against the damp pavement. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began gently, a respectful smile on his lips. "Are you Mary?" Mary hesitated, uncertain and wary, yet curiosity overcame her caution. "Yes," she replied softly, brushing her tangled hair behind her ears. Her voice trembled slightly with apprehension. "I have been sent by Mr. Jonathan Reeves," the driver explained politely, gesturing toward the limousine. "He requests your presence at the Grand Plaza Hotel. He wishes to speak with you personally." Mary felt her heart skip a beat, confusion and surprise battling within her. Thoughts raced through her mind. What could the billionaire possibly want from her? She remembered vividly the previous afternoon, comforting young Ethan during his anxiety attack. Perhaps she had overstepped her boundaries somehow, yet the memory of the boy's relieved face filled her with quiet confidence. After a moment of hesitation, Mary gathered her courage, nodded gently, and followed the chauffeur to the car. Inside, the plush leather seats were warm and inviting, a stark contrast to her usual harsh surroundings. As the limousine pulled away smoothly, Mary gazed out at the passing city streets, a sense of anticipation growing stronger within her chest. She had no idea what awaited her, but something told her that this unexpected invitation was about to change her life in ways she never imagined possible. Weighing his words carefully before continuing. "Yesterday, at the park, you accomplished something truly remarkable," he began softly, his gaze deeply appreciative. "You reached Ethan in a way none of us have managed. Not me, nor the doctors, nor any therapist I've hired. You gave my son comfort and hope in a way that money simply can't buy." Mary felt her cheeks warm, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Jonathan moved closer, speaking quietly yet with unmistakable emotion. "I invited you here today because I have an offer, well, more of a request. I want you to be Ethan's companion. Not as a therapist or a nurse, those roles haven't worked. Ethan doesn't need someone with diplomas or titles. He needs someone with compassion, patience, and genuine care. Someone with a true heart." Mary's eyes filled with tears as she considered his words, overwhelmed by the unexpected faith placed in her. Memories of her own lost son surged within her heart, mingling pain with newfound purpose. The thought of guiding Ethan, being there for him, and perhaps rediscovering meaning in her life, felt profoundly right. Meeting Jonathan's hopeful gaze, Mary smiled softly and replied with quiet determination, "Mr. Reeves, I would be honored to help Ethan in any way I can." Mary's heart fluttered anxiously, her hands tightly clasped in her lap as she processed Jonathan's unexpected request. Doubt surged through her mind, clouding the warmth she had felt moments before. It had been years since she was last trusted with caring for anyone. Once upon a time, she had proudly worn a nurse's uniform, dedicating her days to healing others. But that life had collapsed tragically when she lost her own son. After his death, grief had consumed her, pushing her into darkness until there was nothing left but the streets. Mary's gaze drifted to her worn shoes, memories of happier times battling against years of loneliness and self-doubt. Her voice shook softly as she spoke, eyes glistening with tears she struggled to hold back. "Mr. Reeves, I'm honored by your trust, truly, but I don't know if I can help Ethan. It's been so long since anyone needed me." As she spoke, Mary remembered the emptiness that had filled her days since losing everything: her family, her job, and her sense of purpose. Homelessness had stripped away her confidence, leaving behind only a fragile shell of the caring nurse and mother she once was. Yet, in the quiet of her uncertainty, a powerful image emerged in her mind, the gentle, trusting eyes of Ethan looking up at her, filled with hope during his darkest moment in the park. His gaze had ignited something deep within her, a longing to feel needed again, to find meaning once more in her life. Taking a deep breath, Mary raised her eyes, meeting Jonathan's patient and understanding gaze. Something shifted inside her heart, quiet yet resolute. She realized this wasn't just about helping Ethan, it was a second chance for herself, a chance to reclaim a life of purpose. With newfound courage, Mary finally whispered, "I'm willing to try for Ethan and maybe for myself too." If this story touched your heart, please gently hit the like button and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD, so you don't miss the meaningful next chapter. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into Jonathan's sprawling mansion for the first time. From the outside, the estate had seemed majestic and impressive, yet once inside, the vast space felt strangely cold and empty. She stood motionless for a moment in the grand foyer, taking in the polished marble floors and exquisite chandeliers sparkling overhead. Everything around her radiated wealth and perfection, yet an eerie sense of loneliness lingered in every corner. A well-dressed maid escorted Mary through the immense hallways, her footsteps echoing softly against the immaculate marble surfaces. Mary shivered slightly, not from cold, but from the palpable absence of warmth that hung heavily in the air. Every luxurious detail, from ornate paintings to elegant sculptures, seemed carefully placed to impress rather than comfort. Arriving in the drawing room, Mary sat gingerly on a pristine velvet sofa, feeling distinctly out of place. She nervously glanced around at the lavish furnishings, the fine silk curtains, the polished mahogany tables, and crystal vases overflowing with perfectly arranged flowers. The entire room was spotless, pristine, and utterly lifeless. It was a stark contrast to her own humble surroundings, where warmth came not from material possessions, but from genuine human connection. As Mary waited quietly, she couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. She who had nothing, was brought here into a world where people seemingly had everything, yet lacked something fundamental, emotional warmth. Her heart softened with compassion, sensing the deep loneliness Ethan and his father must feel, hidden behind the elegant facade. With determination quietly forming within her, Mary resolved to bring warmth and kindness into this grand empty house. Perhaps her presence could bridge the divide between luxury and true comfort, and in doing so, breathe life back into a family that had forgotten how warmth and love truly felt. Mary stood quietly in the hallway, just outside Jonathan's study, unintentionally overhearing the sharp whispers coming from within. Her heart tightened as she recognized the voices: Mr. Andrews, the stern butler, Dr. Hoffman, Ethan's highly respected therapist, and Ms. Clark, the boy's meticulous tutor. A homeless woman? Mr. Andrews scoffed dismissively, his voice barely masking his contempt. To care for our young master? Surely Mr. Reeves must be joking. I must agree, chimed in Dr. Hoffman firmly. This isn't about charity. Ethan requires professional care, someone trained and reliable. Hiring someone from the streets is simply irresponsible. Ms. Clark added hesitantly, though her voice carried equal skepticism. Exactly. With Ethan's delicate condition, how could a person who can't even care for herself possibly take on such responsibility? It's absurd. Mary felt her chest tighten further, each word cutting deeper into wounds she had struggled for years to heal. Doubts she'd momentarily set aside now returned, gnawing at her confidence. The sting of judgment, familiar from her years on the streets, resurfaced vividly. Yet, in the midst of their objections, Mary remembered Ethan's face, his trust-filled eyes gazing up at her, the gentle smile he offered when no one else could reach him. She closed her eyes briefly, holding tight to that memory, using it as a shield against their harsh criticisms. Drawing a steadying breath, Mary straightened her posture and stood taller. She knew these individuals had Ethan's best interests at heart, yet none had truly reached the boy's wounded soul. Though doubt surrounded her, Mary believed that genuine care and compassion could often accomplish more than degrees or titles ever could. As the whispers faded behind closed doors, she resolved silently to prove them wrong, not through words, but through the gentle strength of her actions. At first, Ethan watched Mary cautiously from across the spacious living room, his eyes filled with quiet suspicion. After being left behind by so many caregivers who couldn't understand him, he wasn't sure if Mary would truly stay. He remained silent, withdrawing into his protective shell, his small body tense in the wheelchair. Mary understood his hesitation. She'd seen it before. Without saying a word, she quietly took out her worn harmonica from her coat pocket. The instrument felt familiar and comforting in her hands, something she once used to soothe her own son during restless nights. Closing her eyes briefly, Mary began to play a soft, soothing melody, the gentle notes filling the quiet room like a calming lullaby. Ethan's cautious eyes softened as the delicate music reached him. Gradually, the boy's expression shifted from guarded skepticism to quiet curiosity. He leaned slightly forward, his fingers gently tapping the rhythm along the armrest of his wheelchair. With each passing moment, the music seemed to dissolve the invisible wall Ethan had carefully built around himself. Days turned into weeks, and each afternoon Mary returned to sit beside Ethan, playing the harmonica with gentle persistence. Soon Ethan began responding, not with words at first, but with small gestures, a shy glance, an appreciative nod, the subtle tapping of his foot to Mary's melodies. Then one afternoon, as Mary finished playing a particularly tender tune, Ethan slowly reached out and gently took her hand. It was the first time in almost a year he'd willingly touched anyone. Tears filled Mary's eyes as Ethan leaned forward, wrapping his fragile arms around her in a heartfelt embrace. It was a silent, powerful moment. No words were needed to convey the trust and gratitude Ethan finally felt toward Mary, whose quiet patience and warmth had brought him back from a world of painful silence. As days turned into weeks, Jonathan found himself growing increasingly uneasy every time he saw Ethan laughing softly with Mary or gently leaning toward her as she played her harmonica. Initially, he'd been overjoyed by Ethan's newfound happiness, but soon his delight was overshadowed by a creeping sense of discomfort and suspicion. The bond between Mary and his son had blossomed faster and stronger than Jonathan had anticipated, stirring something deeply unsettling within him. Late one evening, standing quietly in the shadows of the doorway, Jonathan watched as Ethan and Mary shared a quiet laugh over a simple story she was telling. He felt a pang of envy mixed with a growing sense of insecurity. Was he losing Ethan to this woman who had suddenly appeared in their lives, with her kindness and warmth? His mind began racing, filling with doubts. Could Mary's motives truly be pure, or was there something hidden beneath her gentle demeanor? After all, she was once a stranger living on the streets. How much did he really know about her past, her intentions? His protective instincts, sharpened by years in the ruthless financial world, told him to be cautious. One evening after Ethan had gone to sleep, Jonathan approached Mary, his voice unusually tense. "Mary," he began carefully, "I appreciate what you've done for Ethan, but I'm concerned about how close you've become. Ethan is vulnerable. You understand why that might worry me, don't you?" Mary's eyes widened slightly, clearly caught off guard by his sudden suspicion. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but Jonathan raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I hope your intentions are genuine," he continued softly yet firmly. "Because if they're not, I'll do anything necessary to protect my son." As Jonathan turned and walked away, Mary stood quietly, her heart heavy with sadness, realizing that trust was not something easily earned, even in a house that desperately needed it. Late one evening, Jonathan's phone buzzed sharply, breaking the quiet stillness of his study. He glanced down at the screen, instantly unsettled by the unknown number flashing across it. With growing anxiety, he opened the message, and his heart immediately sank as he read the words illuminated before him. "The woman you hired was fired from a hospital for stealing medication." Jonathan felt a sudden rush of anger and betrayal wash over him. His fingers tightened around the phone, and questions spun rapidly in his mind. Could it be true? Had he allowed someone untrustworthy to get so close to Ethan? Doubt and suspicion surged violently through him, overshadowing any previous warmth or appreciation he had felt toward Mary. Unable to contain his fury, Jonathan stormed down the hall toward the living room, where Mary sat quietly reading to Ethan. His voice trembled with barely restrained anger as he entered the room, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Mary, we need to talk now," he demanded sharply, startling both Mary and Ethan with the unexpected harshness of his tone. Mary stood slowly, concern shadowing her face. Ethan's worried eyes flickered between his father and Mary, sensing tension thickening in the air. Without waiting for privacy, Jonathan's voice lashed out, filled with hurt and accusation. "I trusted you, Mary. I welcomed you into my home, gave you responsibility for my son, and yet now I learn you were fired for stealing medication." Mary's eyes widened in shock, her voice trembling as she desperately tried to respond, "Jonathan, please, that's not." But he cut her off harshly. "I can't believe I allowed myself to be deceived. Ethan deserves better than lies and betrayal. I want you out of my home immediately." Mary stood frozen, feeling tears welling in her eyes, her heart breaking under the weight of Jonathan's accusations. Her gaze moved helplessly toward Ethan, who sat silent and confused, gripping tightly onto the familiar worn teddy bear Mary had given him. Without another word, Jonathan turned and stormed away, leaving Mary alone in stunned silence. Ethan stared helplessly up at her, his eyes wide and frightened. Mary quietly knelt beside him, placing her hand softly on his shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered gently, hiding her own pain. She offered him a reassuring smile even as her heart ached deeply. Mary knew she could not defend herself now, not while Jonathan's mind was clouded by anger. With quiet dignity, she prepared to leave, hoping someday the truth would finally emerge. Mary stood quietly in the center of the grand entryway, her worn coat hanging loosely around her shoulders. She knew no amount of explanation could break through Jonathan's wall of anger and suspicion. The sting of his accusations lingered painfully in her chest, but she refused to let her emotions spill out. Instead, she clutched the old teddy bear gently in her trembling hands, her last connection to Ethan. Taking a deep breath, Mary slowly approached Jonathan, who stood silently near the doorway, avoiding her gaze. Without anger or resentment, she softly placed the worn, comforting toy into his reluctant hands. "Ethan will need this tonight," Mary whispered, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart. She paused briefly, meeting Jonathan's eyes one last time, her expression filled not with bitterness, but sadness. Without another word, she turned and quietly stepped out into the chilly night, leaving behind only silence and regret. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his bedroom, confused and increasingly anxious about Mary's abrupt departure. The room suddenly felt colder, emptier, the comforting presence that had once filled his days abruptly ripped away. Overwhelmed by loneliness and frustration, Ethan began shaking uncontrollably, his breathing quickening into panicked gasps. His small hands clenched tightly into fists as confusion transformed into raw anger. A desperate scream erupted from deep within him, echoing painfully throughout the mansion. With tears streaming down his face, Ethan knocked the books and toys from his shelves, shattering lamps and picture frames, releasing months of pent-up grief and pain. Jonathan rushed into the room at the sounds of chaos, stunned by the sight of his son spiraling into such distress. Ethan's face was flushed red, eyes wild with anguish as he threw himself into deeper despair, crying inconsolably. Seeing his son suffer so violently reminded Jonathan painfully of those dark days after the accident, days he believed were finally behind them. Realizing his terrible mistake, Jonathan's heart sank heavily. He glanced at the teddy bear Mary had left behind, resting untouched at the foot of Ethan's bed, and felt a powerful wave of remorse. His misplaced anger had torn away Ethan's only source of comfort, the gentle woman who had finally begun to heal his son's wounded spirit. Holding Ethan tightly in his arms, Jonathan whispered apologies through tears of regret, hoping somehow he could repair the damage his distrust had caused, but fearing it might already be too late. In the quiet solitude of his study, Jonathan paced anxiously, awaiting news from the private investigator he'd urgently hired. His heart had become heavy with guilt and regret, haunted by Ethan's anguish since Mary's departure. Suddenly, his phone rang sharply, startling him from his troubled thoughts. He answered quickly, bracing himself for the truth. The investigator's voice was calm yet tinged with sympathy as he began to relay Mary's past. With each word, Jonathan felt his stomach churn painfully, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he'd so hastily accused of betrayal had never stolen medication. Instead, she'd been cruelly framed by a corrupt doctor. Mary, an honest and dedicated nurse, had courageously refused to falsify hospital records, making her a threat to the doctor's illegal schemes. To silence her integrity, she'd been unjustly accused, publicly shamed, and ultimately fired from the profession she had loved dearly. Yet the injustice hadn't ended there. The investigator continued, his tone somber, explaining how Mary's life spiraled tragically after losing her job. Without employment, she'd also lost her health insurance, leaving her unable to pay for her son's critical medical treatments. When the hospital coldly turned them away, citing her lack of coverage, Mary was forced to watch helplessly as her beloved child succumbed to illness, a loss so devastating, it had driven her to homelessness and despair. Jonathan sat heavily into his chair, stunned and heartbroken by the story. The truth weighed heavily upon him, revealing Mary not as a deceiver, but as a courageous woman whose strength had been shattered by profound loss and injustice. She'd quietly borne unimaginable suffering, yet had found it in her heart to offer Ethan the compassion and warmth that even Jonathan, with all his resources, had failed to provide. Filled with deep remorse, Jonathan buried his face in his hands, tears streaming quietly down his cheeks. He had acted impulsively, blindly allowing suspicion to cloud his judgment and rob Ethan of the one person who truly understood his pain. Determined now to right his wrong, Jonathan knew he must seek Mary's forgiveness and restore her dignity, both for her sake and for Ethan's healing. As night settled silently over the mansion, Jonathan resolved to find Mary, not just to apologize, but to offer her the justice she deserved, and the chance at redemption she had so courageously earned. Alone in Ethan's darkened room, Jonathan sat quietly at his son's bedside, gently clutching the crumpled note Mary had left behind. The small lamp beside Ethan's bed cast a soft glow over the handwritten words, now blurred by the tears welling in Jonathan's eyes. His fingers trembled as he read Mary's simple yet powerful message once more. "If this little bear makes you smile just one more time, then my life hasn't been in vain." In that moment, Jonathan felt an overwhelming rush of clarity and shame. How could he have judged Mary so harshly? His heart broke as he realized the depth of her kindness and the profound suffering she had endured. She wasn't simply a compassionate woman who had cared for Ethan. Mary was also a mother, just like he had once been a husband and father, now carrying the heavy burden of loss. She'd been a dedicated nurse whose life had tragically unraveled, stripped away unjustly by cruelty and circumstance, until nothing remained except resilience and compassion. With each word of the note, Jonathan saw clearly the parallels between their lives. Both had once had everything they held dear, only to lose it all in an instant. Yet Mary had chosen kindness, choosing to give rather than succumb to bitterness. In stark contrast, Jonathan had built walls around his grief, isolating himself and Ethan from genuine warmth and healing. Tears spilled silently down Jonathan's face as he looked across at Ethan, now sleeping fitfully, clutching tightly to the worn teddy bear Mary had lovingly entrusted to him. Jonathan's heart swelled with gratitude and regret. The true worth of Mary's gift was more profound than he'd initially understood. Her quiet selflessness had illuminated the darkness within his own soul, awakening a deep yearning for redemption. Gently folding Mary's note, Jonathan placed it carefully on Ethan's bedside table, determination solidifying within him. He knew he couldn't erase the mistakes of his past or bring back everything Mary had lost, but he could honor her compassion and bravery by becoming the kind of father Ethan truly needed. Rising slowly, Jonathan vowed silently to find Mary, apologize sincerely, and ensure she would never again face the harshness of this world alone. For the first time since tragedy had struck his family, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope that healing was possible, and that kindness, like Mary's, could rebuild lives shattered by pain. The night was bitterly cold, with icy wind sweeping through the empty streets of downtown Seattle. Jonathan Reeves, once a man known for his unshakable poise, now moved with desperation in his steps, stopping at every corner, every shelter, asking the same question over and over: "Have you seen a woman named Mary? She's about 50, kind eyes, carries a small teddy bear." His expensive coat was soaked, his polished shoes muddied from hours of searching, but none of it mattered. He would not rest until he found her. Finally, just past midnight, he spotted a familiar silhouette curled up on a bench beneath a flickering light at a quiet bus stop. Mary sat hunched over, wrapped in a thin blanket, her face pale and weary from the cold. She looked up as Jonathan approached, her eyes widening in disbelief. Without a word, Jonathan fell to his knees before her, eyes brimming with tears. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I judged you before I truly understood who you are. My son needs you," and he paused, swallowing hard. "I do too." Mary stared at him for a long moment, her breath visible in the icy air. She saw not the powerful billionaire now, but a grieving father, raw and humbled, finally unmasked. The next morning, Mary returned to the mansion, not as a stranger or an outsider, but as someone finally seen for her true worth. Ethan lit up the moment she entered the room, his arms outstretched as he embraced her tightly, burying his face against her shoulder. The warmth in the house, once cold and sterile, returned with her presence. Jonathan kept his word. In the weeks that followed, he established a new charitable foundation, the Gao Fund, named in honor of the little teddy bear that had comforted Ethan during his darkest hours. The fund's mission was clear and deeply personal: to support homeless individuals with backgrounds in healthcare, helping them return to the work they once loved and reclaim their dignity. Mary, now a central figure in the foundation, helped guide its vision with compassion and clarity. She wasn't just Ethan's companion, she became a symbol of healing, resilience, and second chances. As spring returned to Seattle, the once cold mansion bloomed with life. Laughter filled the halls, music from Mary's harmonica drifted softly through the windows, and the garden, long neglected, began to blossom under her care. For Jonathan, the greatest wealth he now possessed wasn't measured in dollars, but in the joy of watching his son smile again, and in the quiet grace of a woman who had once been overlooked, but who now meant everything. The evening sun cast a golden glow across the Reeves estate, bathing the once cold mansion in a soft, comforting warmth. In the grand living room, a small audience gathered, just a few close friends and staff, seated in quiet anticipation. At the center of the room stood a modest stage, lit gently by string lights and framed with fresh flowers from the garden Mary had lovingly revived. It was a simple concert, nothing grand or extravagant, just Ethan, his harmonica resting gently in his lap, and Mary seated beside him with her own well-worn instrument. There was no fanfare, no formal announcement, only a shared understanding that this night was special. As Mary began to play the familiar, soothing melody, Ethan joined in, his small hands steady and confident. The notes floated through the room like a breeze in spring, soft, heartfelt, and full of quiet emotion. Every breath from Ethan's harmonica told a story of pain, healing, and the long road he had walked back toward joy. Jonathan watched from the side, unable to hold back the emotion rising in his chest. His son, once locked in silence and sorrow, now smiled as he played, his eyes sparkling with connection and peace. It was a moment Jonathan had longed for, proof that love and trust had found their way back into his son's life. As the final note lingered in the air, Ethan lowered his harmonica and looked up at the small crowd. Then, without hesitation, he turned to Mary with a grin so wide it nearly lit up the room. "I love you, Miss Mary," he said, his voice clear and full of joy. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, and then came the sound of gentle applause and quiet tears. It was the first time Ethan had said those words to anyone since the accident. And he had chosen Mary. Mary's eyes welled with tears as she reached out and pulled Ethan into a warm embrace. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The hug said everything. In that simple, beautiful moment, the mansion no longer felt like a fortress of grief or wealth, it felt like a home. Later that night, as guests departed and the house settled into calm, Jonathan stood alone in the hallway, gazing at a framed photo of Ethan and Mary taken just days before. Beneath it, a small plaque read the words he now believed with all his heart. Sometimes the person with nothing gives more than all the wealth in the world ever could. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan smiled, not the practiced smile of a powerful man, but the quiet smile of someone who had been changed, who had finally understood the true meaning of love, family, and redemption. Life often teaches us that the most valuable things can't be bought: compassion, trust, and the quiet courage to keep going after loss. In this story, it wasn't a doctor, a psychologist, or even a billionaire who healed a broken child. It was a woman who had lost everything, yet still chose to give. Mary reminded us that sometimes, the people who seem to have the least are the ones who carry the most love, the deepest wisdom, and the gentlest strength. Her story speaks to the quiet resilience that so many older folks know well, the kind born not from comfort, but from hardship. And in the end, it's not grand gestures that change lives, but small sincere acts of kindness done with a full heart. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a truth you've always known, please give it a like, and consider subscribing to Justice Reloaded HD. We share stories that honor the strength of the human spirit and the power of second chances.